Hello, everybody. Welcome. We have a special treat tonight. We have Dr. Michael Milburn, professor of psychology at UMass Boston for over 40 years, who specialized in research methods, measurement, and statistics. Happens to be an old friend of mine for a few years now in cannabis. And without further ado, Dr. Milburn.
Dr. Kaplan, thank you so much. Today, I wanted to talk about the Druid app, which my company Impairment Science distributes, and how it can be useful and important for the field of medical cannabis and medical cannabis patients. So why don't I share my screen here? Okay, so as I think everyone knows that medical cannabis and recreational cannabis is the legalization is spreading across the country, actually around the world, and this is potentially a problem because cannabis can produce various levels of cognitive impairment, as research shows, and the amount of impairment depends upon a whole variety of factors, including the variety or strain, how much THC it has, how much a person consumes, but also the frequency and the recency of use that I'll talk about in a little bit. This impairment associated with cannabis raises some potentially important problems in terms of workplace safety, in terms of driving, and these are often used as arguments against legalization. Research, just to sort of give you an example, research has documented a whole variety of effects that cannabis has produced: impaired balance and slows reaction time, hand-eye coordination, whole variety of effects that can result in impairment in the performance of complex tasks. So this is a potential problem for medical cannabis patients because drug testing that was developed in the context of the war on drugs tends to use biological proxies. It's really been influenced a lot by the alcohol breathalyzer that an alcohol, the blood alcohol concentration can be measured, and that is, for a lot of people, sometimes people say most people are impaired at the 0.05 or 0.08 level, but there is no comparable test for cannabis because cannabis is metabolized differently. It can remain in the body for days or weeks after impairment is over. And various federal offices have acknowledged this. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration wrote in 2017 that per se blood tests, so sort of specifying, as I'll mention, a number of states do, a specific level 5 or 2 nanograms per milliliter of THC in a person's blood is a per se, or just on the face of it, we can say, yeah, that person's impaired. But as NHTSA says, those tests are not evidence-based. And the Congressional Research Service followed that up and said, really, there's no reliable test to indicate impairment from cannabis. So, but nevertheless, patients who use cannabis legally for medical reasons can still experience, medical or serious legal consequences if they fail a drug test. Just to give you an example, in Australia, medical cannabis is legal. People have, cards that document that. But if they drive and are pulled over and are tested, have their blood tested, and THC shows up in their blood, it is written into law that they lose their license for 6 months. And this can have, people can lose their jobs, their kids. I mean, it's just really terrible. In the US, there's, it's not countrywide the same, but there are still a number of states that have specified per se limits for THC. when driving. They were sort of the earlier medical states like Washington, recreational states. Washington State put in a 5 nanogram limit into law. Interestingly, in Michigan, where they legalized, had its own driving impairment commission that said, no, let us not specify per se levels, acknowledging the science that that blood tests do not predict impairment from cannabis. And you now have seen in the news a state legislator in Michigan has proposed a bill to actually specify a per se law, just going backwards, and hopefully that will not gain any traction. But you have 7 states that have per se limits, and then you have 12 states with a 0 tolerance standard. So even if there is no impairment, no visible impairment, if people fail a drug test, have THC in their blood, they're guilty of a crime. So it's, well, there is actually some reason for optimism here in the US, that some courts have begun demanding proof of impairment to go along with a drug test failure. So they're saying that if someone fails a drug test, there has to be some additional evidence of impairment, or the courts found, for example, that firing a worker for failing a drug test without other evidence of impairment was not justified. And a number of states have passed some protection for medical cannabis patients in this regard, in terms of the workplace, but also for driving impairment. That, for example, in Indiana, the governor just signed a bill to provide for what's called an affirmative defense, so that lets people present evidence that they weren't impaired to counter the failed drug test. So so the legal situation is in flux, but more and more states, I think, are recognizing the science. So, for example, just a couple months ago, there was a task force in California where there were representatives of NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the AAA, American Automobile Association, the Highway Patrol, and working with the cannabis community with California NORML. They had a commission and recommended against specifying per se laws. And California is big, so hopefully that'll provide a foundation for other states to sort of pay attention. But I think it really behooves, any medical cannabis patients or medical cannabis organizations to lobby their legislators, strongly to demand protections for medical cannabis patients. I mean, so for example, Valium, I've read, is more impairing than cannabis, but there's no test for that. It just says on the bottle, don't drive if you're impaired, after using this. And medical cannabis patients should have the same protection. So given that there is this drug testing regimen around that has been judged in terms of cannabis as not scientifically based, what is the alternative? And the alternative is actually, I would argue, actually measuring impairment. And this is what the Druid app does. I actually originally created the name Druid as an acronym for driving under the influence of drugs, but the work and the applications of the app have expanded dramatically beyond driving, and I'll talk about those in just a little bit. But okay, so how Druid works now. As Dr. Kaplan said, I've had a lot of experience over the past decades with research methods, measurement, and statistics, and it's turned out to be the perfect skill set to create an app to measure impairment. And I did a deep dive into the driving impairment literature, identified capacities that are important for driving that are impaired by alcohol and cannabis, came up and, as I've done for 40 years, designed stimuli to test that. And so the original Druid, as it is now, had 4 tasks that measure reaction time, hand-eye coordination, a person's decision-making, and their balance. And then, and the app is very quick. Originally, it was 5 minutes. Now we have it below 3 minutes. It'll probably get closer to 2 minutes in the next few months. And it's widely available on iOS and Android devices, phones or tablets. And it turns out that creating the app was the easy part. It's taking the data, a couple hundred measurements, and collapsing them down into a single impairment score that is validated and reliable. That was the tricky part that took some research and data collection and so on like that. But just to give you an example of the tasks, the first task, a circle or a square will flash on the screen for half a second. The user is instructed to touch the screen where the target shape appeared, and the non-target shape, they're supposed to touch the white oval on top of the screen. So a person has to make a discrimination between what shape did I see, and then a decision where on the screen am I going to touch it. And so a reaction time is measured under conditions of what researchers call divided attention. So having to do a couple different things at the same time. The second task, people have to estimate the passage of 30 seconds while they're touching circles that flash on the screen. So again, a different divided attention task that's measuring reaction time and errors. We measure how close people's fingers were to where the shape flashed and so on like that. The third task has a circle. It starts moving around the screen when you touch it, and you have to keep your finger on the circle as much as possible while you are counting the squares that flash on the screen. I described the task, and people say, "Oh, that sounds really hard." Well, driving's hard. You got to have full awareness and intensity if you're going to do that, and so that this is, I think, not as complicated as driving. And people, let me just, and the fourth task is just the single leg stand from the standard field sobriety test, that something like a third to a half of the neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum, which control balance. And if you have disrupted balance, you have pretty system-wide impairment. Let me see. I was going to say something else. But anyway, I'll continue. All right, so we've conducted a lot of research on Druid. It's able to measure impairment sort of over time. It turns out it's really reliable. We've had people testing the app, doing it 2 times in close succession. The average difference in scores that we get are a half a point. actually, the average is 0.2 of a point difference. I should mention here, okay, that the Druid score goes generally from about 30 to 75. So a higher number indicates a higher level of impairment. And so here's an example, a graph we have in the app. A person can start at a sort of unimpaired level. If they ingest an impairing subject, alcohol, cannabis, whatever, their impairment starts going up, reaches a peak, and when people stop consuming, then their impairment starts going down over time. The Druid app tracks that really well. Now, what I meant to say is that the app sort of seems hard. In fact, the first time people do the app, often their score is a little elevated. But our research shows that in 3, 4, 5 times doing it, remember it only takes less than 3 minutes, people learn the rules. Oh yeah, circle, square, I got it. The rules are actually pretty simple. And a person's baseline will stabilize. The more someone uses the app, the more precise it becomes in their measurement of their cognitive motor functioning. We have, at this point, really significant peer-reviewed validation published for Druid. First study that was published in 2019 was done in conjunction with police academies in Massachusetts, where they run wet labs, where they have people come in, drink alcohol for several hours, and then the cadets can practice the standard field sobriety test on really drunk people. And they let me give people Druid at the beginning of the study, of the morning or the evening when they were totally sober, and then when they had to stop drinking about 3 hours later. And you can see in this first graph the median amount of impairment when people had to stop drinking, and the BAC was about 0.11, about 11%. That median score was higher than any of the people's baseline scores when they were sober. So that was pretty exciting. We've just, one of the things I was able to do was to get a small business innovation research grant from NIH, from the National Institutes of Health, that funded research at Johns Hopkins that showed that Druid is able to differentiate, to distinguish different levels of impairment from different amounts of THC that a person ingests, either vaping or edibles. And those are this two graphs in the middle here. People either consume 20 milligrams, 5 milligrams, or 0 milligrams, and vaping, you see the curves are distinguishable. And this study was done with infrequent cannabis users. We also did a study with frequent cannabis users in conjunction with Cinnamon Bidwell at the University of Colorado. We looked at frequent cannabis users, and the levels of impairment that we got on the average were just virtually identical. It was really exciting. By the way, I should note that the blood alcohol concentration level, or the Druid score for a 0.08 blood alcohol level was about 55. That's our sort of best estimate on that. And you can see these regular cannabis users in general did not reach that level of impairment. Anyway, so we have, you know, a lot of published validation of Druid now. It's interesting if you look at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, their funding has mainly been focused on finding harms from cannabis, not benefits from cannabis. So that, I think, is beginning to change. And I think Druid can play a real role in that. So most people understand that the effects of marijuana, of cannabis, can be very idiosyncratic, that the same strain can affect different people differently and so on like that. And so for a medical cannabis patient, I think Druid can help identify the sort of the best strain to treat the symptoms, the best dose and dosage schedule that treat the symptoms with the minimal level of impairment. And there are also, of course, some medical conditions that are improved by cannabis, like MS and so on like that. So Druid, in this case, can be used as a way to assess whether a particular medication is working or not, improving. And this is, of course, even beyond, you know, just using cannabis. But so I think it has some tremendous utility there. Actually, you know, aging adults, you know, their reaction time goes down. Research shows that older people who play video games, their cognition improves. Just playing Super Mario Brothers and Angry Birds for a couple of weeks improve their memory functions and so on. So I think Druid can really play a role in, as an aging adult myself, I think could be really improved. It can be really useful. And I think legal implications as well, that if a person uses Druid, can identify that they're not impaired, uses Druid, they can potentially call those data up if they were ever in a position where they needed to. Now, whether you're a medical cannabis, so medical cannabis patients can really vary in terms of how much they want to use it recreationally. Actually, a study just came out saying that 7 out of 10 recreational users are actually using it for medical purposes and kind of self-medicating. So some people like to use it recreationally and get high, some don't want that. And so that really brings us to an issue of tolerance to the psychoactive effects. You know, that some people would like to develop tolerance, some people would rather not. Druid here can be very useful in this case. So we collected data from a daily cannabis consumer who, and so the blue line here, now this is essentially, these are equivalent. I showed this graph before. These are all just 4 sort of over time graphs that represent an hour of Druid measurements on successive days. And so the blue line is the sort of Druid person started around 40, sober baseline, went up. This is using it daily, over an hour and a half, was below 50. All right. Took a 1-day break and then started consuming again. The first day, this is vaping with a volcano vaporizer. The first day after taking the 1-day break, reactivity, as you can see, dramatically higher. Then returning, using it daily, what is it? The gray is the second day in a row, and the yellow is the third day in a row. You can see the reactivity then reduces down, approaching essentially the same, the daily the daily use curve. And that's just saying each of there. Similarly, with a 6-day break, the daily cannabis user, again, the blue is the sort of impairment curve for daily consumption. After taking a 6-day break, the first day after the break, reactivity is dramatically higher than the second day in a row, the third day in a row. Again, return to the daily use curve. Now, Druid is actually such a sensitive measure that it can distinguish, relatively small variations in consumption patterns. So here we had a daily cannabis consumer who used Druid, did Druid measurements over the course of an hour. After consuming, again, sort of starting around a sort of sober baseline in the low 40s. And you see how close these two measurements are. Then the volunteer took a series of 2-day breaks, so consuming every third day, and there was a measurable difference in how impaired, how high they got in that relatively different consumption pattern. So again, additional evidence that Druid can be really useful in identifying what the consequences are of different patterns of use of the consumption of the cannabis. All right, so I hope I've persuaded you that the Druid app can make some really significant contributions for medical cannabis patients that also have legal implications. And just to remind you, Druid is broadly available. It's in the App Store. It's in Google Play for iOS, Android versions, phones and tablets. Check out our website. I should have it there. It's impairmentscience.com. So anyway.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a really wonderful presentation. A couple of questions come to mind. I wrote them down. How did you pick the tests that you selected? What was the process behind that?
Okay, well, I went to the driving impairment literature. Actually, I'd had this idea for this for the app. I ended up having lunch with what was it, Lester Grinspoon, who wrote in the 70s a book, Marijuana Reconsidered. And I'd mentioned to him that I had this idea to measure impairment from cannabis. And he said, oh, you should do that. You should do that. That's a major argument against legalization, that there's no way to measure impairment. So I got a programmer in China and freelance and got it all programmed up. And I needed to find somewhere where I could have someone sort of help me do research, because I was at the time as an academic, not a cannabis researcher. I was a social psychologist. So a new professor in my department had done their postdoc at the University of Washington. They knew people out there. I called there asking if anyone would sort of help me with this research. And then they said, oh, well, you should talk to Jane Metrick at Brown. She's done all this work. She's doing alcohol, cannabis, whatever. So I talked with her and she was tremendously helpful. Sent me a bunch of literature to look at to sort of complement my own, literature reviews. And the same variables kept coming up, reaction time, hand-eye coordination, balance, that were straightforward to sort of design an app to test. It's obviously the app, as I say, it's elegant in its simplicity. There's no pictures of cars moving around or anything like that. It's just a sort of a straightforward measurement tool. And then anyway, and so that's
awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Obviously the publication of these studies that are sort of based on Druid are a form of validation. But I wonder how the individual tests, if they are validated against sort of standard medical, like, do these tests exist in other forms that you were comparing against? Or is this, you're kind of carving new territory for yourself?
Well, actually, carving new territory, I think is a good point, and that's what my path sort of reminds me of is this guy. There's a book, Thunderstruck, all about Marconi and how he created the wireless radio and everything like that. And he wasn't a member of the Royal Academy. You had all these scientists, building these huge antenna arrays, whatever, trying to do this. And he was just kind of a more than a handyman, but whatever. But he hadn't been trained in the specific, theories that you were supposed to use. I came at it from a whole different point of view. What I did was, first off, we were able to calibrate it against the 0.08 level of alcohol, of blood alcohol consumption, because most people have a sense of, oh yeah, alcohol accumulation in your blood, impairment goes up. So that was kind of a meaningful standard to do. And actually so I didn't collect any, again, I'm not a cannabis scientist, so I wasn't able to, collect data using all the sort of standard tools that the researchers have been using for decades. But the traditional approach has been, all right, get people to smoke a joint, and then we give them this 15-minute test to study their reaction to divided attention, or different things like that. So the traditional approach was to have a rather lengthy, because the longer you measure something, more generally the more reliably you can measure it. But so they were really not sort of tracking a whole curve the way sort of Druid does, and so the Druid's brevity really makes it, I think, a more powerful tool. But the research at Johns Hopkins that Ryan Vandry conducted, he actually included all the Johns Hopkins measurement and the standard field sobriety test, walk and turn, and horizontal gaze nystagmus and so on like that. And he concluded that Druid was the most sensitive. I mean, again, there were sort of correlations with these other measures, but he concluded Druid was the most sensitive measure of impairment, better than any other tool Johns Hopkins has. So I was really excited about that.
That is very impressive. Yeah, that's really says something. One of the things that I like about it also is that it's not language dependent, that someone who doesn't necessarily speak English can still get the idea of how to move, how to engage with the app, although I imagine the instructions must be offered. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's an instruction screen for each of the tasks. We've translated it into Spanish, and actually, we just this past week signed a contract with the Modelo Brewery in Zacatecas, Mexico, the largest brewery in the world. They've licensed Druid to use for a year for workplace safety testing.
Interesting. Very cool.
It's really exciting.
How do you, I mean, I think what you were getting at through the presentation was assessing someone's baseline. And imagine if someone is just at baseline, unable to perform at a high standard. If you give them the tests when they're intoxicated toward seeing if they are intoxicated, the fact that you don't have a baseline skews what you can interpret from those results.
Well, actually, what I've just been working on the past week is looking at what is the increase in impairment in Druid score that happens when a person goes from 0 BAC to 0.05 or to 0.08. And so been able to identify that with a 9-point increase, whether people start at 35 or they start at 45 or 50, that reflects the amount of impairment growth that a person experiences.
Oh, interesting. But then how do you account for practice? Because the test is not changing, right? So someone is practicing the second time that they do it, no?
Well, okay. So as I said, the first time people do it, their score is going to be a little high. All right. Mm-hmm. Each time you do it, then typically a new user of the app, their score goes down and then develops a stable thing. Okay, I'm sorry, I actually lost my train of thought. What was your question?
The question is about baseline, and if someone has practiced.
Oh yeah. There is no practice effect. Every time you do the app, it's different. There's no pattern that a person can learn. You can learn the rules of the app, but once you do it, then the more you do it, the more precise it becomes. Your score doesn't keep going down. My baseline over the past 5 years has been going steadily up, just a little bit. So it's up about 3 points in my sober baseline in the last 5 years. It's gone up.
Okay, no, that's helpful.
And I have to say, I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times, as you might imagine.
No doubt.
And if there were a practice effect, my baseline would be going down, but instead it's going up.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Wow, this is a real treat. I appreciate you going through it in such high level detail. How do people get in touch with you if they want to engage or participate or collaborate with you? Oh,
sure. Well, I'm just Mike at druidapp.com. So druidapp.com. At Mike, and happy to talk to anyone.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for spending such time and sharing Druid with us.
Dr. Kaplan, thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. Have a great night.
You too.